So you helped launch the International Tax Justice Network. So and right now, obviously, the giant tax bill that the EU presented Apple with is making headlines. EU regulators found that Apple was paying, in effect, a tax rate of 0.5% in Ireland when it should have been paying 12.5%, and now they've been presented with a bill of 13 billion euro. Were you surprised by this ruling as somebody who's worked on these issues for a long time?
Not at all. I have known Margrethe Vestager, the competition commissioner, when she was still a Danish politician. And I knew she is a tough woman who has her heart in the right place and is a very passionate pro-European. The economics are very clear. What looks like a huge tax bill, because it's splattered all over headlines. Let's put this in context. This is in the context of Apple's sales to EU citizens of, I think, $250 billion, on which profits of about 80 or 90 billion euros, as far as we can see, have been made, if not even more. Now, on profits of 80 or 90 billion euros, a tax of 13 billion, which you rightly said of 12.5%, does not seem like very much, particularly when corporate tax rates in most of the countries that Apple has sold to are actually significantly higher. So this is Apple getting away lightly, because if you were to think that Apple would have to pay a fair rate of tax in Germany, in the UK, in every other country where it actually is making money from, the tax bill would be much higher. I think this is a good compromise, because this is a tax bill that is retrospectively presented, that has caused some economic uncertainty. So it is definitely part of the fault lies with EU policymakers for having Apple get away with it for so long. But of course, from Apple's perspective, this is the minimum it really should be paying. So I think the end final result would be somewhere around this present tax.
Because there's going to be a long legal battle, right?
Absolutely. This will be challenged both by governments, as Ireland has already said, as well as by Apple, and will drag on for a few years. But it lays a marker, it sets a precedent, and it starts a very important, substantial debate, which is how in this 21st century of cross-border operation, particularly of IT and technology companies, does one tax these multinationals? As long as you had traditional manufacturers, there were factories, there were goods, there were workers employed, it was much easier. But where, for example, does Amazon really make its profit? Where, for example, does Google really make its profits? These are hard questions to answer and need cross-border solutions. And this Apple tax bill is a start to that serious discussion.
But I mean, the problem is that these technology companies, they have lived in a world for 1 decade, maybe 2 decades, where they are used to not paying taxes on a substantial portion of their earnings. So their whole business model is based on this, isn't it?
That's true. So that delivers many of them an unfair advantage. I mean, this was one of the great controversies with Amazon versus real bookstores, where Amazon was able to skirt a lot of regulations, including paying fair taxes that many high street bookstores had to actually pay. And it's not a level playing field, and it's totally unfair. But I think, just as has happened historically, as happened with Standard Oil and Monopoly, there comes a point when the public have had enough. There are new developments that policymakers do not anticipate, but something which is a relatively small company versus something which is now, I think, the world's largest company, the attention they get from policymakers and from citizens are very different. And as a sign of natural maturity, which I think everybody would agree, many of these so-called new IT firms have now arrived at, it is high time that rules were made to make sure that they were complying by those same rules, and they played by the same rules as companies in other sectors do. So this is a timely debate, it's a necessary debate, and it's a debate that will end in some form of compromise within the next 2 or 3 years, because without that, this is an unacceptable state of affairs.
So as somebody who's been advising governments on these issues, why is it so hard for politicians to grasp these issues or do something about it? Because you were saying that it's very difficult with these global technology companies, for example. Is it because it's alien to them, or because national legislation can't reach them? Or what's your experience as an advisor?
Well, there's 2 or 3 parts to this. The first is that companies have been very successful in playing countries off each other. So there's been a race to the bottom in terms of corporate tax rates. We can see this in Europe. We can see the flat rates of taxation that some Central Eastern European countries put forward. Ireland's very low corporate tax rate, where the UK has now also going in that direction. We have seen how Luxembourg negotiated under Prime Minister Juncker special deals with corporations. And if a company makes a limited amount of profit, let's say about $1 billion worth, where it attributes that profit is important, because if it is able to attribute that profit to Luxembourg at, let's say, a tax rate of just 5%, Luxembourg benefits, but so does this firm. But this may be at the cost of legitimate taxation of, let's say, 20% in Germany. So countries are played off each other. Everybody is going to go towards this narrow advantage, but it is collectively totally self-defeating. And I think that's what makes politics of cooperation so difficult, because in the short term, this is a zero-sum game. In the long term, of course, if corporate taxes decline a lot, every country, every government loses out. But most politicians' terms, most governments' terms are only 3 to 4 to 5 years. And in the short term, if you manage to lower your tax rate, give special concessions to attract a firm, to create jobs, to increase your fiscal tax base, even if it comes at the cost of everybody else, that is a good thing. We had estimated a few years back that for every dollar that the Cayman Islands makes from being a tax haven, it inflicts a loss of $99 of taxes to other more legitimate economies. That is the sort of magnitude of collective loss that we are looking at. And because it is so big, and because so many governments are under fiscal strain now, particularly in Europe, I think that action will finally happen.
But okay, so let's talk about the economic crisis in Europe, because Apple's defense would be, well, we're the biggest taxpayer on the continent. We created 1.5 million jobs, and they can do what these companies normally do. They can just threaten to move, can't they?
It's hard to see how. I find it hard to think how Apple could be Apple without selling into the biggest consumer market in the world, which is 500 million fairly prosperous EU citizens, which together account for the largest economy in the world. And if you are teeny tiny, let's say Sierra Leone, or if you're teeny tiny, Sri Lanka, and you threaten a corporate giant like Apple, Apple can say, well, we're not just going to do business with you. We don't need you. You need us more than we need you. But I think Apple needs the European Union much more than the European Union needs Apple.
And there's also, isn't there a risk of a reputational damage to Apple? Because under Tim Cook, Apple has been, in a way that the company wasn't under Steve Jobs, trying to, take a stance on gay marriage, civil rights, etc., wanting to be perceived as a good guy. And this threatens that, doesn't it?
Totally. And in the line of past incidents where we have seen Starbucks' brand take a beating because of, again, tax avoidance. We have seen other firms come in the spotlight. We have seen campaigners across countries get their act together and start working together with many of the largest shareholders in order to put pressure, because this is not just about reputational damage. There is also a financial risk. I remember the case of Pfizer, I think, a big pharmaceutical firm, where it had a tax controversy with the American tax authorities and was suddenly slapped with back taxes worth $5 billion. And its share price fell very significantly. Similarly with Apple and with many of these other firms, if they are going to get into these tax controversies, it is going to not just have a reputational damage, which can then lead to business loss and branding damage in the long term, but also immediate financial loss for the shareholders. So I think across the board, be it activists, be it consumers, and be it shareholders and policymakers, everybody is mostly moving in the same direction, which is that such form of aggressive tax avoidance, which might have been acceptable in the 80s or the 90s, is no longer acceptable.
But how come then that the Apple stock has not taken more of a beating since this ruling?
Because there is no immediate financial penalty to be paid, and it's far from clear how the dust will settle. If you look at what has happened with banks, HSBC, UBS, Credit Suisse, many of these others have got into serious tax controversies of enabling tax avoidance and tax evasion, particularly with American authorities, which have had to pay significant amounts of fine, in some cases close businesses. They have paid a serious financial penalty, their share prices did suffer, and they ended up with significant reputational damage. I think the Apple case will go on for a little while longer. There will be a negative impact, and a lot depends on how Apple reacts to this. With grace, it would be my suggestion.
That's probably a good suggestion. So you mentioned this race to the bottom and the risk of sort of companies trying to outdo each other with lowering taxes. And of course, here in Britain, we're in London, Downing Street 10 has already said that they would welcome Apple to the UK, and different British ministers have been trying to paint this ruling as an opportunity for Britain, that now when Britain is going to leave the EU, we think, they might be able to attract businesses like Apple by not being as hard on them as the rest of Europe. Do you see that risk or opportunity?
The British response to the Apple tax fiasco has been rather pathetic and desperate, and comes across exactly as that. What has happened is that post the Brexit vote, the UK has become a far less attractive place for businesses, particularly those businesses that were using the UK as a staging post to sell into the rest of the EU. And as a way of trying to partly address that damage, which has been totally self-inflicted by the UK's Conservative Party, which is in power, they are now trying to claw back some attractiveness for businesses by offering what looks at the outset as desperate deals. Now, one has to remember that the vote against the EU was a rejection of the elite, was a rejection of a system that many in the blue-collar working classes see as rigged against them, a system that many see that favors big, large multinationals, big, large banks. And this, if this goes ahead, will seriously damage the constituency within the Conservative Party that voted for them, the constituency that supported the UK Independence Party, which will see this as a betrayal of the people. Once again, the UK selling out to big corporate interests. So I do not expect this policy to actually be implemented, but it's just rhetoric, a lot of heat and noise without any fire.
So, but there's already movement. There's been talk about lowering corporation tax in Britain as an effect of Brexit. You don't believe in this at all because it would hurt certain parts of the Conservative Party's constituents? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think the tax rate being lowered is corporate tax rate being lowered is a global trend. Where ever since, I think the United States remains the only rich OECD country that has a tax rate now of more than 30% or so. Most others have gone beyond that, and that seems to be the received wisdom, where the concentration of power in capital, which is partly driving the backlash, both in the United States with the Trump constituency, in the UK with the Brexit vote, and on the continent with Syriza on the one hand and Geert Wilders in the Netherlands on the other. This is all a rejection of the system that is seen to be rigged, the system that is seen to favor big, powerful, rich interests of cosmopolitan, cross-border citizens, corporations, financial institutions, and politicians. And this further reduction in the corporate tax rate will only add fuel to that fire. But it is not a special concession to Apple per se. What will really, really rub the British people the wrong way is special concessions of the kind that, for example, Luxembourg negotiated with many of the large firms. But I think the general lowering of the corporate tax rate is part of a secular trend, an unfortunate secular trend, but one that is likely to continue. And the Brexit vote has simply accelerated that in the UK. This would probably have happened anyways.
So according to almost every single economist,